a passionate instigator and dynamic problem solver. Dr. Kevin Ross Emery, the host of the Dr. Kevin Radio Show, will be taking you outside the box, behind the curtain, and identifying the load of BS we are fed every day. And now, Dr. Kevin.
Hello, and welcome to the Dr. Kevin Show here on OMTimes, where we're changing the world, wait for it, one Om at a time. So we have tonight's guest, who I am reaching out to right now because she hasn't called in yet. So I'm going to see what's going on. But until then, we're going to talk about some of the stuff going on in the world. And I'd like to actually start with the fact that Congress actually ended up getting together and having, with the exception of one person, Rep. Joseph Harley, who just won't vote for anything, because if there's a Democrat assigned to it, it must be wrong, it must be bad. That the anti-Asian hate crime bill. I mean, they changed it around some, and they did their normal dicking around with things, but, you know, they passed it. I think it was something like 94-1, and I guess 5 weren't present or whatever, but it was pretty impressive. You know, there is a moment of hope that maybe they can come together and decide to not spoke each other's wheel just because the other party said it. Because the other party wanted it. It has to be wrong. We have to find fault with it. And it's really gotten irritating for us out in America that when you see and you look at how many people are in favor of how many things, but the bickering, the Bickersons, that's what I'm going to start calling the Republicans and the Democrats. The Bickersons. Bicker, get nothing done. We can't support something that the other party did because then they might think that the other party are not the Antichrist. What would happen if the other party wasn't the Antichrist? Oh my God. They might be human. They might actually have a few good ideas every now and then. Now, some of the stuff, it seems like there's more weight on one party right now to really block anything and everything. And historically, I am going to say, it has been a much clearer tact on the part of the Republican Party to drag things out and when they're not in power and negotiate, and then still not vote for it. They just delayed getting it done, hoping that they could get to an election where they could get a majority back so then they could veto it or put their own version up for the vote because now they're in the majority. It's all such a game that the American public really needs to be sick and tired of. We have to change a lot of basic ways in which Washington does business. I know that there are those of you that out there that thought that Trump was going to come up and clean the swamp, and he just built an extension on it and dug it a few feet deeper and showed some really underbelly, ugly side of America. He didn't do any cleaning in that swamp. It's still there. It's still very much all about what keeps the politicians in power and very little with what America needs. So, as I am waiting to see if I get a response, and I will try seeing if I can call her from the number I have her on break. We did have a guest scheduled for tonight, and it looks like I don't know whether she's coming or not. So it may just be Dr. Kevin on whatever I feel like talking about for the next hour. Who knows? It's happened before, and will probably happen again. So But I do want to remind people, if you would like to hear more than the sound of my voice, you can call in for any and all questions, spirited discussions, whatever. You can call in at 202-570-7057. That's 202-570-7057. And so call in. It's your time that you can get access to either any one of my areas of specialty or not so specialty, and ask the question you want, or bring up the conversation that you would like to discuss tonight on the Dr. Kevin Show. And again, hopefully nothing has happened to our guest that would be sad or disturbing. And she may still come in before the show's over. We're not going to know. So from that standpoint, I'm going to go on and I'm going to actually talk about something that I'm doing right now. I've got a few different things coming up. I am going to be doing my final edits. I'm doing my final edits right now. Actually, I'm editing the editor. I'm looking after the editor has finished and made all of her changes, and it's been edited 4 or 5 times. But sometime in the next, probably by summer, I am going to have out my first science fiction book. And it is going to be a science fiction book where you are going to be able to make a choice for the character. This character will have 3 choices. You're going to choose one, and one is going to lead them to get killed earlier on and is only part of a book. And the other 2 move forward until you have a choice point. The first choice point comes after the first 2 chapters. So in chapter 3, you get to choose whether you're going to go path A, path B, or path C, and see what happens and how that unfolds. And then then one of those paths gets completely eliminated. And then you come down at the end and you have a choice between the remaining 2 paths, and one keeps the hero alive and keeps and solves the issue. It's a science fiction, a cross between a science fiction and a murder mystery. And it is, and the other one gets them killed again. So you can, if you decide to get the book, when the book comes out, you'll be able to follow and read 1, read 2, read all 3. And of course, because I love to do this, the book does leave you open for this character to come forward again in a future book. Da da da! Imagine that. So that's some exciting news for me. I'm going to have that science fiction book out, and I'm going to have the second book out in my fantasy fiction series. We'll be hitting the stands this year, as well as we're gearing to get 1 more spiritual book out and 2 or 3 more poetry books out. So I actually want to go back and talk a little bit about this science fiction book and how it came into creation, because it's a very interesting story, and it is about sometimes really just following your intuition, following your intuitive. And, it's interesting because, as many of you know, but I never know what new listeners may be coming on board on the Dr. Kevin Show, I started doing professional psychic work in the 70s. But it's always easier to do psychic work for somebody else than to do it for yourself. And even as long as I've been doing that, longer than I'm sure many people at the sound of my voice have even been alive, that still I have been known to push away a little intuitive insight or a little dangling message. Fortunately for me, it only needs to get a larger 1 or 2 times before I let it go. I embrace it, I let go of whatever resistance I might be having or too busyness I might be having. Most of the time I catch them sooner or later. Occasionally they have to come up and smack me in the face because that happens. But several years ago, which is when this science fiction book began, it actually got its start, so to speak. I was living in Seattle, Washington, with my partner at the time, a man named James, and my father. I had gotten a call that my father was sick and that he was going to not be able to live on his own and go home after he left the hospital, and that they didn't think he would be capable of self-care or whatever. I had always made a promise to Papa that I would never let him go into a nursing home unless it was absolutely the only choice because of the level of care he needed. So I was flying in to assess the situation myself. So I flew in with James from Seattle, Washington, into New England, went up to the town that he lived in, a small town in central Maine, and realized that, he wasn't really as bad as they thought. And one of his real problems was he was being over-medicated and living on his own. And in the dead of winter in north central Maine, it's a short day and times get confused. And he was having more of a being over-medicated and getting off of wrong schedule issues than he really was incapable of taking care of himself. It's like, you slip on a chunk of ice and you just can't quite get up, but you can't find anything to hold on to that's steady enough to keep you going. So the story starts with flying home to Seattle, where we actually made the decision we were going to let go of our house, get rid of everything, and go back and move in with my father so that he could be at home. So we're having our bags checked for an overnight flight. And the kid, that young man that was taking my bags, his name was Jedediah. And I thought it was an interesting name. I really kind of liked it. And I looked at him and I said, I like that. I said, I think I'm going to steal your name. And he laughed. And my partner, James, said, my partner at the time, James, no, he's not kidding. That name is going to show up as a character in one of his books. He's a writer. And the kid kind of laughed. And we got on there. We got on the plane. And I remember getting back into the Seattle airport as the sun was kind of rising on the coast, off the coast, and waking right up and saying to James, when he was waking up too, they were announcing the plane was landing and all that stuff. Typical red eye. I am going to write a character. I'm going to do a 24th century character, science fiction, named Inspector Jedediah Kirk. And he's going to be like a 24th century Sherlock Holmes. But it's going to be, on other planets and worlds. And James, at that point, I think we'd been together 4 or 5 years. So he was kind of used to the craziness that lives in my head. And he said, okay, sounds good. I love science fiction. I'll help, I'll read it and do whatever. So we're going back to Seattle to do that, to liquidate the house, sell everything, try to make arrangements that Papa will be able to leave the hospital and go home, and somebody will stay with him just to make sure his meds are correct and things like that until we can get there. And a few days later, I get contacted by somebody who wants to commission me to write a science fiction book. And they had a platform where they wanted to release a multimedia experience. And this is long enough ago that it was not happening anywhere. It was like a new idea. This guy was putting together a platform. He created a unique online publishing company, and he had read something else I had written, and he knew somebody who knew me, and through channels reached out. So we went to negotiate this deal of writing this science fiction book that he wanted less than a week after I said, I'm going to be writing a science fiction book. And I walked into the meeting and I said, well, I already have the title of the main character and the title of the book. And so let's talk about what you're talking about. And because it was going to be a multimedia, we were going to be working in music, and there was going to be different, like all of these things. And they wanted to launch it at a big book show that was happening. And at that point, James was acting as my manager. And so he's kind of negotiating everything about this science fiction book. And then they said, there's a little thing, first of all, it's not going to be it's not going to be like a full book. And he's like, well, I'm like, well, what are you talking? Well, more like a novella. I'm like, well, how many pages are you talking? And he goes, well, 125, 150 pages, but it has to have also 3 separate plot lines. And they explained how they wanted me to do this, and this would be the perfect kind of book for a multimedia project. And then they said, and James was like, yeah, he can do that, but let's be real. It's a book, 100 to 125 pages of a single plot line, and then 2 additional plot lines that have to be followed. He's writing a book, so let's make sure we're clear. This is a book he's writing. And so they, kind of said, okay, yeah, I guess you're right. Then they wanted to make sure, so that it would be a good seller, that I put some kind of, that I made sure there was some kind of sex in it. And I was like, okay, well, I'm out of here. I have nothing against sex at all. Love sex. And if there's an appropriate reason for sex, for sex to be in a book or a movie because it moves a plot point along or something, and it's just not gratuitous sex, I'm okay with that. I'm far from a prude. But to make a requirement that I had to have a sex scene in it because I thought it would sell better, I'm like, you don't really understand a science fiction audience, do you? I mean, I'm sure there are science fiction people out there that are fine, that may like to have a sex scene. But there's a lot of science fiction out there where sex never gets involved anywhere in anything per se, that sold very well and is very successful because, there's a lot of sci-fi audience where they're not looking at it to, get a little thrill from a gratuitous sex scene. They're more interested in, were you consistent in your races? Were you consistent with this? On all these different things. So so I said, yeah, no, that's a deal breaker. So come back to hear the rest of how this intuitive message led to the book coming out this year here on the Dr. Kevin Show.
Conscious media for conscious minds. OMTimes. Have you ever wondered how to change your love paradigm? The secret key is finding a love partnership, not just a regular connection. How do you find these? Through conscious relationships. Ascending Hearts Dating is a dating site for people like you that believes in second chances and a different type of spiritual connection. Try Ascending Hearts for free today at ascendinghearts.com and change your love paradigm. Ascending Hearts, the premier dating community for the spiritually awake.
Hello, I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes magazine's flagship radio show, What is Going On? My passion is sifting through information, research, and innovations from New Thought teachers, speakers, and researchers pushing back the boundaries of what we know about life, energy, metaphysics, and the universe. I love shifting perceptions about who we are, why we're here, and how quickly impossible becomes normal when we open our minds, expand our awareness, and accept that the only limits that exist are those we place upon ourselves. So if you're the kind of forward-thinking, eager investigator of what lies beyond the current reality that most perceive, why not make a date to come play with me in the field of possibilities at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday, and together we can discover what's really going on.
Coping-19, brought to you by CDC and the Ad Council.
If you're feeling increasingly lonely right now, you're not alone. It's totally normal. Even though we may not be able to get together in person, connecting virtually with friends and family still gives you a chance to interact with people and may help raise your spirits. Join a virtual book club, set up group text chats, or online video coffee breaks with coworkers.
Find more self-care and coping tips at coping-19.org.
Hey, you got to do what you got to do. So I want to welcome everybody back to the Dr. Kevin Show. Remember, if you'd like to ask any questions, have any conversations, you can do so by calling in at 202-570-7057. We're not sure what happened to tonight's guest. I know we've been promoting that we were going to have her on. I have texted her and I have left her a voicemail just now on break that she could still call in and we could continue the show with her. But if not, we're just going to keep going, as my producer says, on the adventures of Dr. Kevin, as we're talking about the fact that I have a science fiction book coming out this year. And I was telling some of the intuitive little twists and turns and things that happened that made this book come together. For any of you out there that have ever wanted to write a book, or if you have written a book and you have questions about anything to do with that, please feel free to call. At this point, I don't know. I've got 16 or 17 or 18 books on the market. I lose track. I have the hard books. I have a bunch of hard books. I have a bunch of e-books. I have a bunch of audio books. I don't know. I got a bunch of stuff out there. So I'm happy to answer questions on anything from spirituality to ADD, ADHD, to being a writer, to being an uber creative, or any questions you might have for me. You can call in at 202-570-7057 and ask away. Until then, I'm going to finish the story. So I left you on a cliffhanger. I was getting ready to walk out the door because they wanted gratuitous sex in the science fiction. And then they relented and they said, okay, well, whatever, we'll trust, because they liked the other book I wrote, which had no sex in it. So what happened next was I looked and they said, oh, there's one other little detail as they're working out all of this. And I said, what's that? And James said, well, what's that? We need the book in 6 weeks. And I'm like, what? And James is like, not a problem. He can get it to you in 6 weeks. Well, let me tell you, there was a little conversation that happened when I left the room. I'm like, 6 weeks? And he goes, you can do it. I know you. You wrote your Experiment Earth book, you told me, in 5 days, because it was before him and I were together, which was true. It was 5 obsessed writing days, and it was a 200-page book. So, I mean, but I was like, I've never written a science fiction, and there's a lot to it. But you committed I could do it, and I didn't challenge you in front of the people. I sat there, so we'll make it happen. But we're packing up the house, driving across the country, and he goes, and I'll do all the driving, and you can sit there on the passenger side and work on the book. 2 weeks into our travels across, he's getting nervous because he says, have you started the book yet? And I'm going, no. He said, well, what's all the stuff you're writing? And I'm like, it's a science fiction. It's backstory. And I said, I've written almost 100 pages of backstory. What is this universe? What are its rules? What are the planets? What are the alien races? What do they look like? Where do they come from? What do we know about them? What are their cultures? What are their spiritual beliefs? What are their mating practices? And I have 100 pages of stuff that will come out in the book, but will never be part of the book. And a few days later, I started writing the book. Then we had to get it edited, and we had to go back through it and do all that stuff. And we came in 6 weeks and 3 days from the day that we signed the contract. They let us know later that actually they could have given us an extension up to another 3 or 4 weeks, but they didn't want to tell us that because they wanted to have that kind of leverage just in case. So the book is done. The book was through its initial edits, which I was never satisfied were done as well as I wanted them done, but we had a time deadline. They go and they launch this book, and within, I'm not even sure, I don't even think it was a month, the company went out of business. There was something that didn't work quite on the tech. They were trying to launch it at this book show. It was a disaster. It was a startup company. Whatever happened, I got the rights and the book back to me. And it had sat there ever since. Now we're talking, this is 2008, 2009? I can't even remember. And it's just sat there ever since. And then finally things coalesced in the right way and the opportunity to bring it out. Not in the same way, but it's still going to have the way, and it will be born this year. So I wanted to share that with listeners. And again, I'd like to encourage people to call in at 202-570-7057 if they'd like to ask a question, open up a conversation, do a comment. But I have that going on. I have the sequel to the Paradox Prophecies, which is the name of the alternative reality fantasy fiction series I'm writing. And that also was the character that is the lead character in that one. I was staying in England on the top floor of it was originally a Cardinals, I say house, but this thing was huge, with full barns and that had been turned into health club and just, that had been built, I think, in the 1100s or something like that. And definitely not a castle, but it was a manor house type of thing. And got up one morning to watch the sunrise in the little window seat I was sitting in. And I am watching the horses in the paddock, and I hear this voice in my head, and Sir Thaddeus Cumshaw Stevens introduces himself to me and says, I'm going to write a series of books, and he's going to be the main character. And a lot of the spiritual principles or ideas that I'm trying to share with the world that won't necessarily hit certain audiences, I'm going to weave into this series that I am doing, which led to the Paradox Prophecies. And with Sir Thaddeus Cumshaw Stevens. Now, I was like, okay, well, okay, I'm up for it. And when we got on the train, and I was with my ex-Tommy at the time, well, he wasn't my ex at the time, he's my ex now, but Tommy and I were on the train to go to the Isle of Wight. And it was our second time in England. But we had never been down to the southern part of the country. And we actually got on a train, and one of the stops was Cumshaw, England, spelled exactly like I had seen it in my head when I wrote his name down, of who this Sir Thaddeus Cumshaw Stevens, and that's what his name, and I can still hear his voice in my head. So this is going to be a series, again, alternative reality, more fantasy fiction. The first book is out, and it is traveling around solving the great mysteries of the world. What really happens? And with a team of 20-something highly psychic, intuitive, very special kids, young adults, varying ages, who are just discovering what their powers are. Now, I just want you to say these are not like X-Men powers, but there are some pretty impressive psychic powers that these kids have. And then Thaddeus is a bit of a mystery, and will stay that way through a great part of the series. So, again, another time when it's like my characters come and hunt me down. They find me. They prepare the way. It's an interesting way to write, and there was a lot. It took a long time to get Sir Thaddeus up and actually running, but we made it work. And so he is out, and he came out last year, and the sequel will be out this year. So those are a couple of exciting things coming up for me, which I don't usually get the chance to talk about on my own show, because we either have astrology or a guest on Thoughtful Thursdays, or Lori and I are talking about things, or Matt and I are. And this month, on the last show of the month, because there's 5 Thursdays, I am reinitiating the Power of Poetry series, which I did several years back for a while. And this is the invitation I want to put out to you. Next week, we did have a guest poet who is going to be coming on, and the two of us were going to be taking turns sharing poetry back and forth and inviting our listeners to share their original pieces of poetry. I'm all about supporting the arts and artists. Somebody who has been writing poetry for a very long time and has several books out and has won awards, and poetry was always my first love of writing. I like to support and promote it as the art form that it is. And so the Power of Poetry is going to be on that 5th Thursday every month that has a 5th Thursday. So there'll be 4 Power of Poetry shows this year. Unfortunately, we just heard that the poet had a death in the family, and it has to go take care of a family member and is not going to actually make it. So we are reaching out to some other people. But if you have an original piece of poetry that you would like to share, you're welcome to call in live on air and share it. If you've written a piece of poetry, but calling in live and on air and sharing it makes you nervous, then you can send it to me at Dr. Kevin, DrKevin, at mydrkevin.com. And you can send that. I will look at the poem and I will read it on air for you. I used to do this back when I lived in Seattle, and I belonged to the Columbia Tower Club, which is the tallest building, and they had the top 2 floors of the tallest building in Seattle. And it was a beautiful club. It was great food, and it was a business, more of a business type club. But I started a poetry club there when we'd get together once a month while I lived in Seattle it would have 20, 30 people that would show up, and we provide wine and appetizers because you had to be a member. But I always said, if you are not comfortable reading your own poem, then me and I had a couple of other people volunteered that they would read it for you. I know that if Lori Powers Auto is going to be helping me on this venture this year of bringing back the power of poetry. And there's been more interest in it since the Amanda Gorham poem has been rocking the world with all of its power and beauty. And so, but if you say, you know, I'd rather hear it in a female voice, I know that Lori would be more than happy to read it if you have a preference, or I've read lots of other people's poetry for them. I've mentored poets, I've taught poetry, and I am more than happy to make sure that your poem gets heard and you get to hear somebody else read it if you're not comfortable doing it for yourself. It's just about exposing the world to all the great people who are doing great things in the arts, and poetry qualifies under that the majority of the world don't get a chance to hear. And so if we can give it a little megaphone on the Dr. Kevin Show, we are happy to do that. So we've got that coming up next week, Power of Poetry, our first Fifth Thursday for 2021, and are looking forward to that. And I do know we've got a couple people calling in that have already reached out privately to say that they're going to call in and share some poetry. So it won't be 2 weeks in a row of just hearing the sound of my voice. And of course, Lori will be on next week as well to help to kind of, actually, she's going to more host the show and talk about the poetry, as she doesn't have any at this point that she wants to share, but is going to kind of hold that role as I'm going to be sharing some of the poetry out of some of my current collections that are available on Amazon. And so we'll be doing that next week, and I'm excited about that. I am actually putting together a new collection right now called Patriotism, Politics, and Poetry, born on the 4th of July, because I was born on the 4th of July, where a lot of the stuff that I've written lately, they got a little bit more about politics and patriotism and what does it really mean and things like this. Though it won't all be that, but that's going to be a major thing. And that collection will actually be out later this year. So another exciting thing. So for those of you who are not familiar, I'm also doing a lot of stuff on Clubhouse. You know, if you've ever wanted to work with me, you know, some of you, I don't know how many years I've been on OMTimes, but we'll be right back for the last part of the Dr. Kevin Show.
The Real Conscious Connection. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM. The number one reason girls drop out of school in sub-Saharan Africa is lack of access to feminine hygiene products. The Pads for Schoolgirls Project, an outreach of Humanity Healing International, is changing this paradigm by setting up sewing programs at schools, teaching girls a vocational skill, while producing the reusable pads that help keep them attending classes. The girls pay it forward by making and giving pad kits to other girls in need. To learn more, visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Vox Novus, the new voice. Vox Novus, the new dimension. Vox Novus, thought and movement leaders who will share from their experience and offer tools to help us navigate our rapidly changing world. My name is Victor Furman. Join me every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio for Vox Novus, the new voice.
If I could be you,
and you could be me, for just 1 hour.
if you could find a way to get inside
each other's mind.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
We've all felt left out. And for some, that feeling lasts more than a moment. We can change that. Learn how at belongingbeginswithus.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
Hello, and welcome back to the last segment of the Dr. Kevin Show here on OMTimes. We're kind of having a free-for-all Thursday, as our guest today, for unknown reasons, did not make an appearance. I'm hoping that she is okay, and I'm sending her good energies that nothing horrible has happened. So I have reached out and left her messages. She could possibly call in for the last segment of the show, but we're going to assume at this point that we're probably not going to hear from her. So if you tuned in to hear of tonight's guest, I do apologize. It is beyond my control. However, we're kind of having a free-for-all set of conversations. And if you would like to introduce a conversation, ask a question, be part of the conversation, you may do so by calling in at 202-570-7057. That's 202-570-7057. So we've already in this episode talked a little bit about Congress passing a joint bill. Oh my God, pinch me, make sure I'm awake. For an anti-Asian hate crime, about anti-Asian hate crimes. We talked about, I've got a science fiction book that's coming out in 2021 and a little bit of the intuitive and evolving story of how it got written and a little bit about it. And then how my character in my fantasy fiction alternative reality book came and introduced me and kind of gave me my missive. We were just shifting to the power of poetry, which is going to be on the 5th Thursday of every month in 2021, where we're inviting poets to call in, share their poetry. I'll be sharing my poetry. I'm going to be looking for some guest poets to come in and be a part of the conversation. And Lori Powers Otto will be hosting that show, where she gets to keep us all in line. Good luck, Lori. We wish you the best. And I was just starting to say before the thing is if I've talked about, I have been teaching spiritual classes for 31 years now. I'm not sure how long I've been on OMTimes, but I know I've had my radio show on one station or another all over the boards for over 15 years now. And that if you do ever wonder about being interested in taking any of my classes, a lot of my classes I have made as downloadable. You can get at Weichi University, WEICHI University.com. You can go there, and I have some of the core classes I've been teaching for years that I taped and have made available for people who are not in my area. And with the pandemic, who's been teaching live? And as things are shifting and changing and moving out, I'm going to continue unless somebody really makes a convincing request why I would teach something that I already have on tape and is available. I know it's a little different to have the teacher in the room and be able to ask questions. And I've thought about doing hybrid things where they would watch the classes and then we'd do one live Zoom event afterwards, or even in-person event when it's safe, to go over and to answer the questions and engage the class. I love class engagement. I've always considered myself a teacher first and foremost, loving to share and loving the interactions. But I have a lot more stuff I want to try to get out. And then, speaking of that, the other place you can catch me these days is Clubhouse. If you haven't heard of Clubhouse, you will hear of Clubhouse. It is one of the fastest growing social media platforms that is audio only, doesn't record things, unless you have been told that it can be kind of jury rigged to record things, but the platform itself doesn't hold content, and you can, so you can kind of speak freely and not know that it's going to be on the internet forever used against you. But it also has added a layer of accountability that other social platforms have. Right now, it's only available on iOS, but in May, I hear they're going to be stretching it into Android. But when you come into Clubhouse and you go to a room, if you run a room that is hate-centered or spreading false information or is racist, whatever, you can get thrown out of the club, and you can only get into the club if somebody sponsors you. So you are attached to somebody else. That person, the person that sponsors you, can also get thrown out of the club if you come on and you do a big enough violation against the club rules, which means I have invitations sitting in my box right now. I've invited a lot of people to Clubhouse, and I'm happy to have them on there. But I've had a couple people that they've reached out through Clubhouse, because Clubhouse does everything based on your phone number. So if your phone number is in my phone and you try to get into Clubhouse and there's nobody to invite you, they would notify me. And I have some people that numbers are in my phone that I wouldn't trust to actually not make a kind of blunder that could get them thrown out and me thrown out as well. And so I just let it go by the boards. When you're vouching for somebody and then could feel the accountability of their misstep, you're at least a little more careful. So that being said, I'm doing a lot of stuff on Clubhouse because, again, it's audio only. And you have some big names that have actually got involved. And they have countries from all over the world that are tuning in, so you can meet people. You're supposed to be getting followers that you're building relationships with through building rooms. But, of course, it's a social media platform, so there are always people that are finding ways to work it around. I can say that almost all of my followers, I've got just under 700 now, I think, which is not a huge number for Clubhouse, but it's a decent number, follow me because they heard me speak in a room and they liked what I said and they want to know what I'm speaking again. One of the things I like about Clubhouse is it gives me a chance to do some give back. There are a lot of people out there that could, would benefit or do benefit from information that I share in classes that might never have heard of me, don't know about me, might not be able to afford to take the classes. And I'm not teaching full classes on Clubhouse because that wouldn't be fair for the people that are taking classes and still do take classes. And really a lot of, I do actually do a few classes right now, but they're all master level classes. Very small, very intense for people that are very committed to their spiritual path. And so with that being said, on Clubhouse, I can share a lot of my ADD, ADHD work. I am now doing a regular room on Clubhouse, and you can find me on Clubhouse at My Dr. Kevin, which is where you can pretty much find me anywhere. Pinterest, Instagram, Tumblr, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, at My Dr. Kevin, MYDRKEVIN. That's where you find me. But I am now with somebody who started as a client of mine in the mid-90s and has become her own powerhouse of a healer and spiritual teacher. A young woman named Sherry Jefferson. She and actually has been a guest on my show, not since I've been on OMTimes. I think she was on one of my other, when I was with somebody else. I can't remember. I'm getting old. So, but I know she's been on my show a couple of times at different points during the years. But we're doing from 10 a.m. to noon every Wednesday. I'm putting 2 hours aside to do spiritual straight talk, where people can come in. Sherry and I are going to chat about some topic that either has been suggested by the floor, by previous weeks, and we're going to chat about it a little bit. We're both going to kind of weigh in on it. Then we're going to take questions about it. We're going to take questions about that particular subject, and when everybody that's been in the room has had a chance to ask their questions or their follow-up questions and pick our brains, we're then going to open up the floor for the rest of the time to any and all questions or conversations people want to have. And so it gives a forum, it gives a place for people to come and have access to people that might not normally have access to. Oprah's done rooms there. Elon Musk has done rooms there. There's a couple of, and I say this sincerely, that I just don't remember their names. I know there's a couple of rappers that I heard people all excited about that were on there. They were not people I followed, and frankly, I don't remember their names because it was a while back, but there is a wide diversity of people and a wide diversity of belief systems and ideologies and things that all come together from countries around the world to have these free-flowing conversations. So I did try to actually simulcast the Dr. Kevin show on Clubhouse. My producer has asked me to never do it again. So I think if I got the right sound technology and had the right setup, it might be possible, but I won't do it without including him in the process. I kind of sprang it on him. For those of you who have never heard me refer to myself as an ADD poster child, well, you have now. It is one of my gifts, the ADD, and sometimes I have been known to be occasionally impetuous to the frustration of the people that I work with. But I did try to do the Dr. Kevin show, and again, we may try again as I look at Clubhouse as a place where I may also find some radio guests. Hopefully, ones that show up. That would be nice, wouldn't it? But that being said, I'm doing the Spiritual Straight Talk. I'm going to be doing some poetry events there. I also do some empowerment events there. And I speak regularly on ADD and ADHD, the gift of ADD and ADHD. If you've never heard my definition, I look at ADD as part of the evolutionary process, broadening the bandwidth of humanity, not a disease, disorder, or disability. And I'm very much about widening the lane in humanity to embrace ADD for what it is instead of trying to medicate it, drug them up, dumb them down, make them fit in. Why can't you just pay attention? Why can't you just listen? Why can't you just do it the way it's supposed to be done? Well, maybe they can, maybe they can't. But that doesn't mean that they're disabled. There's a lot of things that people don't necessarily have the bandwidth to do. It doesn't make them disabled, especially when they have the bandwidth to do a lot of great things that a lot of other people can't do. Sometimes you just pick and choose what the things are that are being added. So I do a lot of talk on the ADD and the ADHD. And the other thing I have coming out at a app near you is the Dr. Kevin app will be out before the end of the year. My Dr. Kevin app will actually take in an earlier app that I had where people will be able to answer 12 questions about themselves or their child, and they will get a designation of a shade on the Dr. Kevin rainbow. There are 64 shades, and they'll get a summary of that particular shade that they are. If they choose, they can go and get what is about a 25 to 30-page report to better understand how to work with that shade of ADD and ADHD, whether it's supporting your child, your spouse, yourself, your employee, or your employer. I've worked with enough ADD, ADHD employers, entrepreneurs, and we are coming to the end of the show. Thank you so much for sticking with me this week as I have hopefully amused you, made you smile, made you think, and we will see you next week with Power of Poetry here on the Dr. Kevin Show.